I call them mega threats, but one of the words of the year, according to the Financial Times, was the term poly-crisis that Adam Tooze and a few economists have used to think about the same sets of issues. I was in December on stage with the head of the IMF in Washington presenting my book, and Kristalina Georgieva spoke about what she calls a confluence of calamities like we haven't seen since World War II. And I was just in Davos during the World Economic Forum, and their own yearly global risk report spoke about, again, the sets of both economic and other threats that they discuss, and they refer to threats, to crises, to polycrisis, and a decade to come is going to be as turbulent, unstable, and dangerous as ever. So whether you call it mega threats or polycrisis or confluence of calamities or the most dangerous decade ahead of us, they're just different terms for realizing we live in a world in which all these risks and uncertainties are interconnected with each other. So you have to understand it as a system, not just isolated parts. So that's the ambition of the book. Economists believe in comparative advantage. That means write only about what you know and shut up about the rest. I was a little more ambitious this time. Hopefully, I connected the dots in a thoughtful way.
You mentioned in the book I guess perhaps the problem with mega threats, with risks of this magnitude, slow moving, sort of creeping over the horizon to us, hard to absorb on a day-to-day basis. I wondered if you could help us just sort of make those threats more real by perhaps connecting them to something that might be happening today, for example. I suppose it's another way to help us understand, how your brain works, how Nouriel Roubini sees the world. What are you thinking about today, and how does that thinking sort of connect to some of these bigger threats that you've been spending more of your time thinking about, or certainly spending the COVID period thinking about?
Well, they're connected to our daily lives. This book is not only about what's going to happen in the world in the next 10 to 20 years, but each one of these mega threats is materializing today. I could give you those an example of each. 2 years ago, even the economic and monetary and financial threats have changed. A couple of years ago, we were worried that inflation was too low, deflation. But today we have to worry about inflation, rising food prices, rising gasoline and heating prices, price of rents, and the cost of living in general. It hurts everybody with prices rising more than wages. A couple of years ago, people worried about secular stagnation, not enough demand, low growth and deflation. Now we have to worry about the stagflation, this toxic combination of inflation and recession that we last had only in the 70s, for those who are old enough like me to remember, when you had the two oil shocks of 73 and 79. This time around, there are other negative supply shock, the reduced economic activity, increased inflation. So the worst of all worlds: less output, less employment, more inflation. The impact of COVID initially on production, on supply of labor, on supply chains. The impact of the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia on oil, energy, natural gas, food, fertilizers, industrial metals. The impact of the zero COVID policy of China until recently on global supply chains. Those are all things that have materially affected people. Their incomes in real terms have fallen. Inflation is rising. There is a risk now of a recession, of a hard landing, where there'll be job losses. And a few years ago, we were worried that interest rates were too low. They were zero, even negative. The return to savings were low, but now interest rates are rising sharply because we have to fight inflation. But with large stocks of private and public debt, many individual firms, businesses could become insolvent. Mortgage rates are higher, credit card balances costs are higher, auto loans, student loans, personal loans, business loans, bank loans, bond yields, the interest rate that government have to pay on their own debt. So the risk is of severe debt distress for those who have high debts, a fall in value of their assets, and they have challenges to their revenues and their income if there's going to be a recession. So these are all economic, monetary, and financial threats that affect all of us. And then there is a risk of war between great powers. Could become unconventional, could be nuclear winter. Of course, climate change has huge economic and financial damage. We saw what happens when you have a very severe global pandemic, and COVID is not going to be the last one. And AI may increase the economic pie, but might lead to permanent technological employment, may lead to greater income and wealth inequality, and might lead to create even more deadly weapons to fight even more deadly wars. And then the political manifestation of all this malaise, inequality, economic malaise, people left behind, young people feeling they're going to be worse off than their parents, is a backlash against liberal democracy, against democratic capitalism, and radical populist parties of extreme right or extreme left, unfortunately coming to power in advanced economy, in emerging markets, and so on. So these are all interconnected phenomena and things that each of us can feel and manifest daily in different ways in different countries. You know, rising food and energy prices for us in the West is just painful on our incomes, but in other parts of the world that are poor, leads to hunger, famine, starvation. It's a huge problem. For us, it's just food inflation or energy inflation. For others, there's a risk of famine or starvation.